Hello everyone. Welcome back to Shadow Storyteller. Before we begin tonight's story, don't forget to subscribe, hit the like button, and leave a comment below if you enjoy listening to late night stories before bed. Your support keeps this channel alive and helps me bring you more tales filled with mystery, atmosphere, and unforgettable moments. Now settle in, turn down the lights, and let yourself drift into the setting of tonight's true story. The title is The Night the Tornado Sirens Never Stopped in Oklahoma. It was a humid evening on May 20th, 2013, in Moore, Oklahoma, just south of Oklahoma City. The air carried that heavy stillness that locals had learned to fear. At around 2:30 p.m., the clouds began to stack upon each other, dark and swollen, until the sky looked bruised. For people like Rachel Simmons, a schoolteacher in her early 30s, it was an all-too-familiar warning. She remembered her grandmother's voice, always saying, "When the sky turns green, get underground." By 2:45 p.m., the first wail of the tornado sirens cut through the town. The sound was chilling, long and hollow, echoing against every building. Usually, the sirens came in bursts, a warning to take shelter until they quieted again. But this time, the sound didn't fade. It continued, unwavering, as if the city itself was crying out in fear. Rachel was at Briarwood Elementary School when the announcement came over the loudspeaker. The principal, Mr. Thompson, instructed teachers to get the children into the hallways, away from windows. Some of the kids were trembling, clutching at their backpacks like they were life vests. Rachel knelt down to comfort a boy named Ethan, whose small hands shook as he whispered, "Is it coming here?" The answer hung unspoken in the air, because everyone already knew. Outside, the winds were rising with an almost animal howl. Residents who weren't in schools or workplaces scrambled to their storm shelters and basements. Families like the Harrisons, who lived on South Harvey Avenue, pulled mattresses down into their underground shelter, their youngest child still clutching a stuffed dinosaur. Others, like elderly George Miller, who had no basement, huddled inside a bathtub with blankets piled over him, praying that the walls of his house would hold. At 3:01 p.m., the sky split open. A monstrous wedge tornado touched down near Newcastle and began tearing a path straight toward Moore. From the windows of the school, Rachel and the children could hear it before they saw it. The sound was a low, deep roar, like a freight train mixed with thunder. The sirens never stopped. Their shrill warning overlapped with the roar of the storm, creating a soundtrack of dread that seemed endless. The children covered their heads as tiles rattled loose from the ceiling. Lights flickered, then went dark. The pressure shifted so suddenly that ears popped, and Rachel felt as though the very air had been sucked out of the room. On Heather Lane, a father named Mark Johnston was frantically on the phone with his wife, who was trapped in traffic trying to get home. His voice cracked as he said, "I can hear it. Oh God, it's right here." The call cut off, leaving nothing but static. Neighbors shouted to each other across yards, trying to make sure everyone was inside. The wind ripped fences out of the ground, twisted metal like paper, and scattered debris through the air with deadly force. The tornado was now an EF5, more than a mile wide, chewing through homes, businesses, and schools without mercy. Rachel pressed herself against the floor beside her students, whispering prayers she hadn't said since she was a child. The sound above was indescribable, wood splintering, glass exploding, the shriek of twisting metal. Somewhere in the chaos, a child began to cry, not from fear alone but from the sensation that the building itself might not survive. The minutes stretched endlessly, and still the siren screamed. The roar outside swelled until it seemed impossible that anything human could survive in its path. Rachel pressed the children closer to the wall, her heart hammering as the ceiling above them began to crack. The school had drilled for tornadoes before, but nothing in those practices could prepare them for the sheer violence of what was happening now. Dust swirled through the hallways, stinging their eyes, and every creak of the building sounded like the beginning of collapse. At 3:10 p.m., the tornado was directly over Moore. Houses on Santa Fe Avenue vanished in seconds. A 2-story brick home was lifted from its foundation as though it had been nothing more than cardboard. A pickup truck was hurled through the air, landing upside down in a field half a mile away. Power lines snapped, sparking briefly before the wind carried the light away into the darkness of the storm. Mark Johnston, crouched in his hallway with a mattress pulled over him, could hear the walls of his house groaning. He had lost the call with his wife minutes earlier. Now he could only picture her stuck on Interstate 35, traffic frozen as the sky boiled. His phone vibrated with alerts, but the sirens drowned out everything. He pulled his knees to his chest and shouted to his daughter, 12-year-old Sarah, to stay low. She was under the stairwell, clutching their dog, both of them trembling. In another part of town, George Miller, the elderly man who had no basement, tightened his grip on the rosary in his hand. He lay inside the bathtub, covered with quilts and blankets. He was 82 years old, and his memories stretched back to the great tornadoes of the 1950s. He had thought he knew what to expect, but the sound outside shook him to his bones. The entire house shuddered, as if an invisible giant were ripping it apart. Meanwhile, at Briarwood Elementary, Rachel tried to keep her students calm by humming softly, though her own voice trembled. Some of the children joined in, their small voices fragile against the storm. The building rattled, as if it were breathing its last breaths. Then came the deafening crack of the roof tearing free. The sky opened above them, a whirl of darkness and debris. Rachel threw her arms over the nearest children as glass rained down. The tornado cut a swath nearly 2 miles wide. It didn't slow, didn't weaken. It swallowed everything in its path. Restaurants, churches, playgrounds. The sound was unrelenting. The sirens continued their wailing, distorted now as the speakers themselves were torn from their poles, yet still somehow alive. To those who were huddled in the dark, the unending cry of the sirens mixed with the roar of destruction until it became one continuous note of terror. At 3:20 p.m., Rachel felt the pressure change again. Her ears popped so sharply that she gasped. Then came silence, sudden and absolute, as if the world had inhaled. For one impossible second, the storm's roar ceased. Children looked up, confused, eyes wide. Rachel knew enough about tornadoes to fear this moment. It was the calm of the eye passing over them. And then the second wave struck. The building groaned and splintered. Walls collapsed inward. Lockers tore free and clanged across the hallways. Rachel was thrown against the floor, her shoulder hitting hard, but she refused to let go of the 2 children she held. Around them, the screams of wind and tearing metal filled every inch of space. On Heather Lane, Mark's roof tore away in one motion, leaving only sky above. He threw his body over Sarah, shouting, though he couldn't hear his own voice over the storm. The mattress above them lifted like paper, exposing them fully. For a heartbeat, He thought they would be carried away, but the stairwell held. Debris slammed into the walls, shaking the foundation of the house. George Miller's prayers were swallowed by the roar. His bathtub shook violently, the walls of his house tearing free around him. Through the blanket, he felt the rush of wind and grit. The roof was gone, and the old man clung tighter to the rosary, whispering words only he could hear. He didn't know if he would open his eyes again. The tornado stayed on the ground for 40 minutes. It carved a path nearly 17 miles long. Those inside it had no sense of time, only of survival. Minutes felt like hours, and every sound was sharper than the last. The sirens, miraculously, continued to wail. Some would later say it was as if the city itself refused to give up, even as it was being torn apart. By 3:45 p.m., the winds began to ease. The roar grew distant, like thunder moving away across the plains. But the silence that followed was heavier than the storm. Rachel lifted her head, coughing through dust. Around her, the children stirred, dazed but alive. Where the ceiling had once been, the sky was visible, pale and cloud-choked, still swirling with the remnants of the storm. Pieces of the school lay everywhere, twisted beams and shattered glass. Yet somehow, the hallway where they had huddled had not collapsed completely. Mark pulled himself upright in the wreck of his home. The stairwell was still standing, though the rest of the house was gone. Sarah clung to him, crying into his shirt. The dog whimpered beside them, covered in dust. Mark's first thought was of his wife. He staggered outside barefoot, into what looked like another planet. Entire houses had been erased. Cars lay upside down. A line of trees was reduced to jagged stumps. The air smelled of splintered wood, gas, and earth. George Miller pushed away the blankets, blinking through tears. His bathtub sat in the open, the only piece of his house left standing. Around him was a wasteland of rubble. He tried to stand, but his legs gave way, and he sat back down heavily, clutching the rosary. Above him, the sirens were still wailing, one of the only sounds left in the shattered town. The storm had passed, but the night was only beginning. Emergency responders, neighbors, and strangers would soon come searching through the wreckage. Families would cry out for missing loved ones, and the sound of the sirens would blend with shouts and sobs. Rachel gathered her students and began leading them through the rubble of the school, her voice steady despite the tremor in her chest. She knew parents would be searching desperately, and the sight of their children walking out alive would be a small light in this dark hour. Mark tried to call his wife again, but the network was down. He looked toward the horizon, where the tornado had moved on, and whispered her name. He didn't know if she was safe, or if she had been caught on the road when the storm hit. George sat in his bathtub, waiting, knowing someone would come. His heart was heavy, but he was alive, and for now, that was enough. The sirens finally faltered, their endless cry breaking into static. The silence that followed was almost unbearable. But for those who had survived, it was not the end. It was the beginning of a long night of searching, mourning, and holding on to the fragile thread of hope. The storm had passed, but what it left behind hardly seemed like Earth. By 4 o'clock in the afternoon, Moore, Oklahoma, was unrecognizable. A gray haze of dust and smoke hung low over the ruins. People stumbled out of shattered buildings and broken homes, their faces streaked with dirt, blood, and disbelief. The silence after the sirens felt heavier than the noise had been, broken only by the distant crackle of fires and the occasional cry for help. Rachel led her students carefully over the debris, each step uncertain. The hallway had collapsed in places, and she had to guide them through jagged holes in the walls. She counted the children over and over in her head, terrified that one might have been left behind. Dust clung to their hair and clothes, their small faces pale with shock. She saw parents running across the rubble-strewn parking lot, their eyes wild as they searched. When the first mother spotted her child among Rachel's group, the woman screamed with relief and dropped to her knees, clutching the boy as though she might never let go again. Further down South Harvey Avenue, Mark staggered through what had once been his neighborhood. His wife, Julia, had not answered her phone, and that absence gnawed at him with every passing minute. Sarah walked beside him, still gripping the dog, though her hands trembled so badly she could barely hold the leash. The devastation around them was almost beyond comprehension. Entire blocks had been scoured clean. Cars were reduced to twisted metal, tossed into trees that no longer had branches. The familiar landmarks of their town, the diner where they ate pancakes on Sundays, the church with the tall white steeple, were gone. "Dad," Sarah whispered, her voice thin. "Where's Mom?" Mark swallowed hard, trying to steady his breathing. "We'll find her. She's out there. We just need to keep moving." Emergency sirens from fire trucks and ambulances began to rise in the distance, mingling with the sound of shouting voices. Volunteers and first responders rushed into the chaos. Some carried stretchers, others pulled at the wreckage with bare hands. The late afternoon sun, now breaking through gaps in the clouds, cast a cruel light on the destruction. It illuminated everything: shattered glass glittering in the streets, broken toys lying in mud, a school notebook caught on a splintered fence. On what had once been his front porch, George Miller sat in the bathtub that had saved him. Neighbors found him there, dazed but alive. They helped him stand, wrapping a jacket around his shoulders. The old man looked around, his eyes watering as he took in the absence of his house, his yard, and nearly every memory of his life and more. Still, he whispered a thank you, clutching his rosary tightly. By 5 p.m., makeshift triage centers had been set up in parking lots and church basements that had survived the storm. Paramedics worked under fading daylight, treating broken bones, cuts, and head injuries. Parents searched for children who had not come home from school. A local gymnasium became a gathering place for the displaced. Families reunited in tears, while others sat in silence, waiting for news that might never come. Rachel stayed with her students until each one was claimed by a parent or relative. She held back her own tears as she handed them off, offering small reassurances that felt empty in the shadow of so much loss. When the last child was gone, she finally allowed herself to sink to the ground, her legs shaking. Around her, the schoolyard was gone, replaced with wreckage. She thought of the other teachers, some of whom had been in classrooms that did not survive. The weight of it pressed down on her chest. Mark and Sarah reached one of the emergency gathering points by sunset. The sky glowed orange and pink, a cruel contrast to the wreckage below. Survivors gathered in clusters, whispering names of the missing, asking if anyone had seen them. Mark moved from group to group, repeating his wife's name. Julia Johnston. Dark hair, blue sweater. She was driving on the interstate. Has anyone seen her? Each time, the answer was the same: shakes of the head, murmurs of sympathy. Sarah sat on the curb, stroking the dog's fur with trembling fingers. She stared at the horizon, where the storm had moved on, leaving only bruised clouds and fading light. She didn't cry anymore. She just sat in silence, her eyes hollow. Night fell quickly. With the power lines down, the town was plunged into darkness. Flashlights and lanterns became the only light, their beams cutting through the shadows. The air was thick with the smell of smoke, gasoline, and damp earth. People huddled together, wrapping themselves in blankets distributed by the Red Cross. George found himself seated on a folding chair inside a church basement that still stood. Volunteers brought him water and a sandwich, though he could barely bring himself to eat. Around him, the room was filled with murmurs and quiet sobbing. He thought of his late wife, who had passed 5 years earlier. In that moment, he almost felt her presence beside him, as though she had been the one guiding him through the storm. Rachel, exhausted but unable to sleep, walked among the families in the gymnasium that served as a shelter. She checked on her students again, speaking softly to parents. Some children clung to her, unwilling to let go, even in the safety of their families' arms. When she finally sat down, she leaned her head back against the wall, listening to the quiet hum of voices, broken occasionally by a distant cry. The sirens were silent now, but the memory of their endless wails still echoed in her ears. Outside, rescue teams continued through the night. They used floodlights and generators to illuminate the wreckage. Dogs barked as they searched for survivors beneath collapsed buildings. The wind had calmed, but every rustle of debris carried tension. Hope flickered in the dark, fragile but alive. At midnight, Mark still hadn't found Julia. He sat on the ground, his arms around Sarah, staring into the distance as though willing her to appear. He tried again to call her phone, but the line remained dead. His thoughts spiraled. Was she trapped in her car, injured somewhere along the interstate? He closed his eyes and tried to remember the last words he had spoken to her. They had been ordinary, almost careless, about groceries and schedules. Now they felt like a weight he could never lift. George dozed lightly in his chair, waking often with a start. Each time, he had to remind himself that he was alive, that the storm was over. He had survived, though he wasn't sure why. Perhaps survival itself was a kind of burden. Rachel finally allowed herself a moment to cry. Silent tears slid down her cheeks as she thought of the children she had shielded, of how close they had come to being swept away. She thought of the parents who would never see their children again, and she thought of the town itself, scarred forever, though it had endured storms before. As the early hours of the morning approached, the survivors sat in the dim shelters, waiting for dawn. The town of Moore was quiet now, but its silence carried the weight of everything that had happened. The night stretched on, heavy and restless, and though the sirens were gone, the memory of their unending cry lingered in every heart. The story of that night was not yet finished. The hours ahead would bring more searches, more reunions, more heartbreak. And for those who had lived through it, the sound of the tornado sirens, the night they never stopped, would echo for the rest of their lives. When dawn finally came on May 21st, 2013, the town of Moore lay in silence, broken only by the distant hum of helicopters and the occasional call of rescuers moving through the ruins. The first rays of sunlight revealed a landscape so altered it was difficult to believe it had once been a community filled with homes, schools, and neighborhoods alive with laughter. Now it was a scar across the plains, a stretch of flattened earth where lives had been torn apart. Rachel had not slept. She sat slumped against the wall of the gymnasium, her eyes raw from crying, her throat dry from dust and exhaustion. When the first light filtered through the broken windows, she rose stiffly and looked at the families who had made it through the night. Some were still asleep, curled together on thin mats, while others sat awake, staring into nothing. Children clung to their parents, unwilling to let go even for a moment. She stepped outside and was struck by the stillness. The sky was pale blue now, as if nothing had happened, but the ground told another story. Rescue teams had been working since the storm passed, and they continued now with renewed urgency. She watched as neighbors lifted debris from a collapsed house, calling out a name over and over. A few blocks away, the faint sound of a siren carried through the air, not the endless wail of the night before, but the sharp cry of an ambulance. On the other side of town, Mark and Sarah were still at the emergency station, surrounded by strangers who were now bound to them by tragedy. Mark's face was drawn, his eyes red from fatigue. He had spent most of the night searching among the shelters, calling out Julia's name, holding up her photograph on his phone. Each time, the answer was the same. No one had seen her. At sunrise, he tried again. This time he walked with Sarah down the road toward the interstate. The highway was a scene of chaos. Cars overturned, some reduced to unrecognizable heaps of metal, others lodged in ditches. Emergency workers combed through the wreckage, checking each vehicle. Mark's stomach twisted as they passed one crushed sedan after another, terrified that one of them might belong to Julia. Sarah held his hand tightly, her knuckles white. She hadn't spoken much since the storm, and her silence weighed heavier than words ever could. George Miller, escorted by neighbors, returned to what had been his home. He stood at the edge of the rubble, staring at the spot where his living room had once been. Only the bathtub remained, sitting in the open like a monument to survival. A volunteer offered to help him sift through the wreckage, but George shook his head slowly. He didn't know what he was looking for. Most of his possessions, his photographs, the little artifacts of his 82 years, all were gone, yet he still felt something pulling him back, as if in the ruins there might be a fragment of the life he had lost. By mid-morning, television crews had arrived. Reporters stood against backdrops of destruction, their voices solemn as they described the devastation to the rest of the world. Drones hovered overhead, capturing aerial views of the flattened neighborhoods. To the people of Moore, it felt surreal, as though their tragedy had become a spectacle. Yet some were grateful that the world would know that help might come from beyond their shattered town. Rachel joined other teachers as they checked in with one another. Some had survived, others had not. News spread quickly that another elementary school had taken a direct hit, and lives had been lost there. The weight of it crushed Rachel, and she fought back tears as she thought of the children she had taught, the ones who would never walk through her classroom doors again. She found comfort only in the faces of those who had survived, fragile but alive. Mark and Sarah moved through the wreckage along the interstate until a rescue worker stopped them. "We've got survivors in that section," the man said, pointing toward a cluster of cars. Mark's heart leapt with a surge of hope so sharp it hurt. They hurried forward, clambering over twisted metal until they reached a group of workers pulling a woman from a car. For a moment, Mark thought it was Julia. The woman's hair was dark, her sweater torn and dusty, but when she turned her face toward them, Mark's heart sank. It wasn't her. He felt Sarah's grip tighten, her silence screaming louder than words. The day stretched on, heavy with grief. Names of the missing were written on boards set up at the emergency shelters. families scanned them with desperate eyes. Volunteers handed out water bottles, sandwiches, and blankets, but many couldn't bring themselves to eat. The air was filled with the sound of hammering, sawing, and the relentless voices of rescue teams calling into the rubble. At noon, Rachel helped distribute supplies to parents and children. She moved like a ghost, her body numb, but she refused to stop. Each small act, handing out a bottle of water, guiding a child to safety, was a way to push back against the helplessness she felt. She watched as people hugged tightly, clung to one another, and wept openly. In that broken town, grief and love walked hand in hand. George sat on a folding chair under a tent set up by volunteers. Someone had found a photograph frame in the wreckage of his house, the glass shattered, the picture torn. It was a photo of him and his wife taken on their wedding day, 60 years earlier. He held it gently, his hands trembling. For the first time since the storm, tears spilled down his cheeks. Around him, people passed by, each carrying their own fragments of loss. Yet in that moment, George felt less alone. By evening, the shelters were crowded. The hum of voices filled the gymnasium where Rachel sat once again, watching families huddle together. She thought of her own small apartment, which she had not yet seen since the storm. She didn't know if it still stood, but she found herself too afraid to check. For now, her place was here, with the children and parents who needed her. Mark stood outside as the sun set, staring at the horizon where the sky burned orange. He held Sarah close, her head resting against his chest. The search for Julia had brought no answers, only questions that gnawed at him. Was she out there, alive but hurt? Or was she gone, taken by the storm as so many others had been? He pressed his lips to Sarah's hair and whispered, "We'll keep looking." The night settled in again, heavy and restless. Lights from generators cast harsh beams across the ruins. The sound of helicopters continued overhead, a reminder that the world was watching. Inside the shelters, some managed to sleep, though their dreams were haunted. Others sat awake, unable to close their eyes, the memory of the tornado still roaring in their ears. For Rachel, for Mark and Sarah, for George, and for every soul and more, the night was long. The tornado was gone, but its echo remained, carried in the silence, in the cries of the grieving, and in the memory of that night when the sirens never stopped. In the days that followed, more began to rise again from the wreckage, though nothing could erase the scars left behind. Streets once lined with houses were now fields of splintered wood and twisted steel. Families built makeshift memorials, placing flowers and photographs where their homes had once stood. Volunteers from across the country arrived, bringing supplies, food, and hands ready to help clear debris. The town breathed slowly, painfully, but it was breathing. Rachel returned to her classroom weeks later. Though the building was temporary, a borrowed space in another school, she carried with her the memory of that afternoon, of the endless sirens, of the children huddled close to her. She had become a figure of strength for many parents, though she never saw herself that way. In the quiet moments, when the wind howled outside, she still felt her stomach twist with fear. Yet she stood, because the children needed her to. George moved in with his niece in Oklahoma City, leaving behind the ruins of the home he had shared with his wife. He never let go of the cracked wedding photograph he had salvaged from the debris. To him, it was proof that even in the face of destruction, love endured. Each night, he prayed for those who had not survived, and for the families still searching for answers. Mark and Sarah eventually learned that Julia had not made it home. Her car had been caught on the interstate, swept into the storm's path. The news broke them in ways words could not describe. Yet in their grief, they found each other. Mark held Sarah closer than ever, and Sarah clung to him, both of them learning to move forward together, even as the shadow of loss followed them. And so, life in Moore continued. The people carried the weight of that night in their hearts, the memory of when the sirens never stopped. For some, it was the sound of terror, a warning that came too late. For others, it was the sound of survival, a reminder that even when the storm roared and the sky fell apart, they held on. The town would rebuild, brick by brick, day by day, but the echoes of May 20th, 2013, would never fade completely. They lived on in the stories told at dinner tables, in the quiet tears shed at memorials, in the way neighbors checked on one another when the sky grew dark. Because in Oklahoma, the wind will always return, and when the sirens rise again, everyone will remember that night when they did not stop.